I was asked to talk about Sir John Forrest, and I'm delighted to do so, because my friends in Western Australia are sick of hearing me talk about Forrest. Nobody in New South Wales want to hear about him, and you're the first to hear about him in South Australia. When I was asked to give this talk, I thought that perhaps I might be able to gear it towards South Australia in perhaps an important way, but after long hassles I found that I wasn't able to do it as well as I thought I was able to do. Then it occurred to me that perhaps you might be interested in a different style of talk. So I'm going to try something novel with you tonight, and I hope you'll bear with me. I think it's often been said, rightly so, that the most successful biography is autobiography. That is, there has to be a complete empathy between author and subject. And tonight I want to share with you, as a new way of talking about history, a very difficult personal problem that I have. A trauma, if you like. I want to tell you tonight, and bare my soul, why I haven't yet finished the biography of Sir John Forrest. Even though long ago I published the first volume of it. And I want to tell you how I've tried to finish this biography, and I also want to tell you why I haven't succeeded. And in doing so, I want to be, if you'll bear with me, autobiographical. Because I think in one way or another, my private life has had much to do with the disaster, as it were, that's prevented me finishing the biography of Forrest. So, I'm trying something rather new, and I hope that maybe when I've finished you'll understand what it's all about. I began to write the life of Sir John Forrest so as to escape from Western Australia. I had done a decade of work in Western Australia using the local clay. And I produced from it some useful works of general history and regional history and bibliography. But as time passed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, I felt burdened by the intellectual confines of the university and the city and the state, all of which I'd come to know extremely well. And frankly, I couldn't bear the prospect, early in the 1960s, of spending another 25 years in Western Australia. So I looked for a way of escape, and I found it in Forrest. And for very simple and straightforward reasons. Half Forrest's career was in Western Australia, and half in national politics. The first, I thought at the time, I could do by using the local clay, as I did in South Australia. But the second would give me the chance to use the national clay. And then I hoped that I would be accepted, as it were, back into the Eastern Australian community from which I'd come, which at that time hadn't really come to grips with the problems of political biography. So in a real sense, what you're going to hear tonight is a series of instalments about how I converted the writing of biography of Forrest into a springboard. Now, I began to write the biography of Forrest at a time when the biographical industry in Australia was not big business. Nowadays, thankfully, Australian biography is in a very healthy condition. 7 large volumes have already been published in the series The Australian Dictionary of Biography. And the number of biographies of Australians being published each year is 5 times greater than it was 15 years ago. And an even larger number are in preparation. In Western Australia, the celebration of the sesquicentenary produced a volume called Westralian Portraits, which illustrated the willingness of writers and readers to be interested in the lives of people in all the professions and in all walks of life, not just the leaders. And we can expect comparable volumes, I think, to be associated with similar forthcoming celebrations in South Australia and in Victoria. And undoubtedly, the Australian Bicentennial Project of 1988 will produce a flood of biographical type publications. Now tonight, I want to talk about the life of an Australian who made significant contributions to both Western Australia and to national public affairs. And I want to try and pose and answer the sorts of questions which I think should be asked by political biographers in Australia who are working in this field. In particular, 4 of them. First, was Forrest's political style charismatic or merely efficient in a pedestrian style? Secondly, was Forrest a statesman or merely a political gardener who improved the landscape? Thirdly, was Forrest a man of national vision or merely another local politician suffering from regional paranoia? And fourthly, was Forrest a genuine liberal, dedicated to the betterment of society, or was he merely a reactionary, dedicated to the conservation of wealth and its associated political power? And as I try to answer these questions, unavoidably and also unashamedly, I'll also be answering those sorts of questions about myself. For I've long been a believer in the observation that the proper study of biography, as of history, is as much of the biographers as of the subjects of their biographies. Now, John Forrest was born in August of 1847, south of Perth on the coast. And he and his 8 brothers, as they grew up, were taught to help with the household and other chores of a self-contained mixed farm. And in due course, in their teens, the boys were enrolled at a normal government primary school. And in 1860, Forrest followed his elder brother William to Bishop Hales School in Perth. Now this was a select little private school which, like St Peter's in Adelaide, offered a secondary education with a strong Anglican elitist flavour, and which, before it closed in 1876, created the core of the establishment whose values dominated the public life of Western Australia, not only during the last 2 decades of the 19th century, but in a very real sense still continue to dominate the establishment of present Western Australia. John Forrest did well at school and subsequently joined the government service as a surveyor in 1865. And thereafter, until he became Premier in 1890, was a civil servant and surveyor on the staff of the Surveyor-General's office. He did a variety of work as a surveyor, and especially as a land surveyor, and in 1869, as most of you will know, was offered appointment as second-in-command and navigator to the eminent Melbourne botanist, Dr. Ferdinand von Mueller, who was starting to lead an expedition from Perth in search of clues to the fate of the long-lost Leichhardt expedition. And when von Mueller couldn't make the trip, Forrest was chosen to succeed him. Like everybody since, Forrest found no traces of Leichhardt and no good pastoral land. But he did systematically survey his route using the most up-to-date methods of stellar observation, and brought back interesting specimens for botanists and geologists. In fact, as a very young man, Forrest was one of the first in Australia to establish his reputation on the basis of trigonometrical surveying using stellar observation, in contrast to the normal techniques of land surveyors in Australia who simply relied on chaining. Late in the same year, the Governor of Western Australia decided it would be appropriate to mount a proper survey expedition of the route between Western Australia and South Australia, which had been taken 30 years earlier by Eyre, who had made a hasty trip on foot along the coast from the head of the Great Australian Bight to Albany on King George Sound. And since then, that's since Eyre's time, nobody had come to Western Australia overland except Aborigines, and white historians, of course, aren't interested in those. Forrest was appointed leader of this party, which is duly eulogised in all Western Australian school textbooks. But in fact, the tangible results of this expedition were almost negligible. It was the first west to east crossing of Western Australia by land, and it showed that a telegraph line could be readily erected along the coastline, and this was done. But Forrest and his companions found only one new pastoral region, which was far distant from civilization and practically waterless. However, this expedition did bring widespread publicity to John Forrest and to his brother Alexander, and confirmed Forrest's own confidence in his ability and in his style of command, which he was to sustain for the next 30 years of his public life. His objectives were boldly conceived, but cautiously exercised. He was rarely compelled to advance without any knowledge of what lay ahead, as later in politics, or to advance only because it was impossible to retreat. As a surveyor skilled in terrestrial navigation, he couldn't possibly get lost, and his occasional gamble in the daily search for drinking water and feed for his horses was always well calculated in advance. He never indulged in the spectacular or tragic gambles that brought fame but seldom success to other Australian explorers, especially Leichhardt. In 1871, the newly appointed Surveyor-General, Malcolm Fraser, reorganised the Survey Department in Western Australia and appointed John Forrest Government Surveyor for the Northern District. And in the next few years, Forrest initiated the first of the major trigonometrical surveys to be established in Australia, in the northwest. Eventually, Forrest was nominated to be associated with an expedition to cross Australia from west to east in the middle. Eventually, Forrest, in April 1874, crossed the centre, reaching the overland telegraph line, and for the second time reached Adelaide in November of 1874. Forrest had therefore led the first west to east expedition through the centre of Australia, but he readily confessed that the practical results of the journey had not been great. Most of the country traversed was never likely to be settled, and to the present day never has been settled. Nevertheless, Forrest's reputation in the mid-1870s spread rapidly throughout Australia along the new telegraph lines, which had been erected during the previous 10 years, and press accounts of his courage and endurance attracted the attention of politicians and scientists in Britain. So in 1875, Forrest did his first grand tour, visiting London and meeting the aristocracy and becoming well known in the governing circles of the British Empire. As a result of this, he was promoted to the position of Deputy Surveyor-General and received the Founder's Gold Medal of the Royal Geographical Society of London. At the same time, he married into the moneyed family of Western Australia, the Hammersley family. He married Margaret Elvira Hammersley, the eldest daughter of Edward Hammersley of Guildford, who stood in the front rank of Western Australia's territorial and social elite. Margaret Forrest, at this time, was a petite and vivacious woman, then 31. She was a talented watercolourist And if you wish to visit the Western Australian Art Gallery any time, you would do well to ask to see Margaret Forrest's watercolours of Australian botanical specimens. They are still considered to be in the top class. There were no children of her marriage. During the next few years, Forrest was engaged in further trigonometrical surveying, and in 1878, at the age of 30, he was slightly younger than his wife, served for a while as acting Surveyor-General and Commissioner of Crown Lands with a seat in the Executive Council. And this, in fact, was the first time that a colonial-born Western Australian had been admitted to the highest council in the government of his colony. He achieved a number of other administrative offices, and finally, when there was a series of changes in the upper administration of the colony, he was recommended for appointment as Surveyor-General of Western Australia, and this recommendation was approved by the British government in London. John Forrest held the position of Surveyor-General and Commissioner of Crown Lands with a seat in the Executive and Legislative Councils from January 1883 until December 1890. And this appointment marked a watershed in his career. He was then 35 years of age, and by perseverance and leadership, he had overcome 3 disadvantages. He had been colonial-born, he was rough-hewn, and he had no family collections at home in London. But he proved able and willing, and as an administrator, he was extraordinarily successful. He carried over into his day-to-day administration of the Lands and Survey Department all those habits of thought, expression and command which he developed as a field surveyor and inland explorer during the previous 20 years. Now, when I had reached this stage of the writing of the biography of Forrest, I had a small personal crisis. In Western Australia, there is a women's organisation called the Karrakatta Club, one of the oldest women's clubs in Australia. And I was approached by the executive and asked whether I thought it wouldn't be appropriate, because I was working on Forrest, to write something about his wife. Reluctantly, I agreed to do so, but first I said I'll give a talk. I gave a talk to the Karrakatta Club. It was reasonably well received, and I then subsequently published an enlarged version, and therefore entered the club of males in Australia who have written biographies of women. I thought at the time, and I still do, that my short biography of Margaret Forrest wasn't too bad. Subsequently, I've developed a quite contrary opinion and feel, for a whole variety of reasons, that perhaps the gender line should never be crossed, and if it is to be crossed, with exceeding caution. It's subsequently been republished by the Western Australian Museum, so I suppose it's got a buying public. I went on with my researches, and after 1883, researched the life of Forrest as he became involved in the higher levels of Western Australia's administration and politics. I then began to record the minutiae of the interminable struggles in the top executive between a lot of men who seemed to have a lot of time to get involved in trivial discussions and arguments. Nevertheless, in 1883, Forrest organised the first large-scale survey of what is now called the Kimberley district, which had been first explored by his brother in 1879, and this was his last experience of field work. The year after, in 1884, he published a small booklet which was called Notes on Western Australia, with statistics for the year 1883, and this became the foundation of the later Western Australian yearbooks. In 1885, he became involved in the lengthy investigation into the Crown Land regulations, and in the same year he successfully piloted through the Legislative Council, there was no Legislative Assembly, a new set of regulations designed to introduce into Western Australia a bold peasantry. whose arrival the colony was hopefully awaiting. Finally, to cap his colonial career as an administrator, in 1887 he visited London to represent Western Australia at both Queen Victoria's Jubilee celebrations and at the first colonial conference. As he was a government officer, Forrest didn't take an active part in the public discussions about responsible government, which agitated Western Australia in the late 1880s. But from the outset, he had privately seen himself as the prime contender for appointment as first Premier of Western Australia, as he was the only member of the old Executive Council who wanted to continue in public life after the introduction of the new system. And his manoeuvring successfully frightened away the only possible contender, who was a man called Stephen Henry Parker, who subsequently became Chief Justice. Forrest then was elected unopposed as the member for the Legislative Assembly electorate of Bunbury, his home district in the new Parliament, and on the 29th of December 1890 was sworn in by Governor Robinson as Colonial Treasurer of Western Australia, and thereby Premier. Now at that time, nobody else in Western Australia had such personal support, length of experience and administrative ability as Forrest. He was also well off financially as a result of his marriage and successful speculation in land. In May of 1891, he was made a Knight Commander of the Order of St Michael and St George, the KCMGs that we're all familiar with in modern Australia, liberally distributed by Liberals, and was the first local board to be so honoured. And he held office as Premier and Treasurer until the 15th of January 1901, which at that time established a record for longevity in Australian colonial politics. When Forrest formed his first cabinet at the age of 43, he was head and shoulders above all his contemporaries by force of personality, by his record, and also physically. He was then, at the age of 43, nearly 6 feet in height and weighed almost 16 stone. Now, at this stage in my writing of the biography of Forrest, though a little younger, I escaped from Western Australia. I resigned from the position of a tenured reader in the University of Western Australia to take a short-time position as a research fellow in Hugh Stretton's Department of History in the University of Adelaide. He having done me a favour, I did him one in return, at least for his students, and produced the Research Student's Guide to South Australian History. 18 months after that, I was appointed to the staff of the University of New South Wales. 3 years after that, having reorganised the School of History at that university on a reasonable basis, and being Forrest's age when he became Premier, I thought it appropriate that I should then resume work on the biography, and I duly brought to publication Forrest's biography to 1891, which was published by the University of Queensland Press as I thought at the time an appropriate age. At that time, I then became diverted by other obligations. There was pressure on me to write as editor and contributor the New History of Australia for use in Australian universities. I was also seduced into meeting what was said to be a well-felt need for documents on 20th century Australia. Subsequently, publishers thought I ought to meet a well-felt need for documents on 19th century Australia, especially on colonial Australia. Having met all of those obligations, I then resumed in August of 1979 with the biography of Forrest that I had neglected for so long. Now, at no time during the 1890s was Forrest challenged for the position of Premier, and he never had an heir apparent like Menzies. His government was never close to dismissal by Parliament, and he was also careful not to press any issue too close to a situation of no confidence in himself, unless absolutely certain he had the numbers. And he survived numerous defeats on individual measures or withdrew items when the situation wasn't promising. Forrest and his ministerial colleagues won all elections in the 1890s, even though there was an increasing opposition, especially based on the eastern goldfields. Forrest never created a political party, or an extra parliamentary organisation, or even a faction of his supporters within the Parliament, which had been the fashion common in Eastern Australia in the 1870s and 80s. From time to time, he called what he called a caucus together, when he wanted martial support for some patriotic or national proposal. But it was the social round, centred on his wife and his home in Perth, which was the most important device which secured the personal loyalties on which he depended. The Forrests had a legion of relatives by birth and by marriage, many of whom were influential in Parliament and in business. And when he died, he left a will leaving his entire estate to be equally divided amongst his and his wife's surviving nieces and nephews. And when the estate was finalised in 1929, there were 50 of them. Forrest never had to put up with an effective parliamentary opposition. There was no Labor Party, and there was no party political system until after he had left Western Australia in 1901. Forrest's political program was complemented by an unsophisticated political style, which was to act as a sort of broker who decided which public works would be given to which districts. And this he did by receiving deputations at his office in Perth, or else by travelling during the parliamentary recesses, making speeches, meeting the people and hearing about their needs. Nevertheless, like so many of our current state politicians, he also had some overriding policies which modified his activities as a district broker. First and foremost, he believed that there should be an apportionment between the needs of the metropolitan, the agricultural, the pastoral and the mining regions, so that railways, water supplies, hospitals, harbours, police stations and so on, and schools, should be provided with a view to long-term needs, after which time the Western Australian goldfields would have declined in importance. His basic principle of politics was to make the prosperity of the present pay for the hoped-for prosperity of the future. The floating population of the goldfields would thereby help those who had a permanent stake in the country. This, of course, was necessarily not a policy which endeared Forrest to the gold miners, who wanted all public services to be supplied as quickly as possible and weren't interested in who was going to pay for them. The Forrest government in Western Australia in the 1890s was extraordinarily lucky. At a time when Eastern Australia was suffering from droughts, depression, unemployment, financial crises and bank crashes, especially the great crash of May 1893, one new goldfield was discovered after another in Western Australia, especially after the discovery of Coolgardie in 1892 and Kalgoorlie in 1893. In fact, Forrest rode the crest of the boom and took the political credit for it, as so many of our politicians do. He also made several bold decisions, which in the long term greatly benefited Western Australia's development, and which, I may say so, set examples for legislative and executive action elsewhere around Australia, and especially the Homestead Act of 1893, the Land Act of 1898, and above all, the Agricultural Bank Act of 1894, which was the first to establish in Australia the agricultural or rural bank that we now know, which was to act as a faucet to supply credit to the rural areas of Australia. He also initiated, as you all know, the Coolgardie Water Scheme in 1894, which was to provide water to the goldfields and to open up what subsequently became known as the Western Australian wheat belt in the centre. The Forrest government also in the 90s initiated some significant industrial, social and political reforms which brought Western Australia into line with the other colonies. To many people, Forrest in the 90s appeared to be a reluctant federalist. But he was in a very difficult position, which required all his skill as a broker of competing interests. From the very beginning, Forrest was a federalist and was constantly in association by correspondence with Kingston and Playford in South Australia. He supported the idea of federation at the very first Science Congress in Sydney in 1888. And if you're interested, you might like to read his published paper in the proceedings of the first Science Congress, which was a straight advocacy of political federation for Australia. He attended the meeting of the first Federal Convention in 1891, and as Premier of Western Australia, he attended all meetings of the Federal Council of Australasia. He attended all 3 sessions of the conventions of 1897-8 and consistently followed the policy of supporting a political federation for Australia and the establishment of interstate free trade, trying to ensure, as the repercussions of 1975 showed, trying to ensure a strong federal Senate to protect state rights where they would be equally represented. He also wanted to make quite sure that Western Australia would not suffer financially from joining the Federation. He was a very cautious politician. He was always both sympathetic and cautious, an attitude which was mainly the result of his local parliamentary situation and his long experience of bargaining. The settled farming areas of Western Australia provided the core of his political support in Parliament, yet they were the most apprehensive, and still are the most apprehensive, of the financial and economic effects of federation. The Legislative Council in Western Australia, the Upper House, was strongly opposed to federation in any form, and one suspects still is. Forrest's tactic was to resist being rushed into federation by the Eastern Goldfields population of newcomers, and also to educate his political supporters in the coastal districts into accepting federation if the conditions of entry could be improved. And in this situation, Forrest in the late 1890s naturally received criticism from both sides. The sand gropers accused him of selling out to the t'other-siders. The Goldfields accused him of nepotistic government supported by a gerrymandered electorate, and in early 1900 started a separation movement to make the Eastern Goldfields of Western Australia a separate colony which could then federate with the rest of Australia. Forrest tried very hard to secure last-minute concessions, in particular the retention of the tariff for 5 years, the right to divide Western Australia into electorates for the election of senators, still a current program, and a guarantee for the construction of an east-west railway. But the eastern politicians weren't sympathetic, and he secured none of them. Pragmatically, he then persuaded his supporters to take what was offered, lest the terms later should be even more unpalatable. And only in that sense was Forrest a reluctant federalist. However, he had long since learned to make the best of a hard bargain. And when finally the Legislative Council of Western Australia agreed to hold the referendum, Forrest led the yes vote, which was successful. And finally, Western Australia joined the Federation. When the Commonwealth of Australia was inaugurated on the 1st of January 1901, Forrest was in deep personal trouble. He could not decide until the last minute what to do. Should he stay on as Premier of Western Australia with an uncertain future, or go to Melbourne and take part in the National Parliament, where he was unknown, unheralded, and probably would be outvoted? Again, he decided on the bold step. He was elected unopposed for the electorate of Swan in the House of Representatives, and in parliamentary session time moved to the Grand Hotel in Melbourne. By then, he was a big man in achievement, in reputation, and in personality, and he was even more massive in physique. In 1901, he had a 54-inch waist and weighed nearly 20 stone. He was also, at that time, one of the wealthiest of the first generation of federal politicians. at a time when there was practically no direct income tax in Australia. He hired a very large suite of rooms in the Grand Hotel in Melbourne, entertained on a princely scale, and his annual income rose magnificently due to his interest in pastoral properties in the northwest of Western Australia. He was successively Postmaster-General for a few weeks, Minister for Defence 1901 to 03, and inaugurated the first Australian contingents to the Boer War. He was Minister for Home Affairs 1903 to 4, and he served as Treasurer of the Commonwealth of Australia in 5 federal cabinets, 1905 to 7, 1909 to 10, 1913 to 14, and 1917 to 18. But federal politics was very different from state politics, and Forrest soon found that he was floundering. The federal parliament, meeting in Melbourne, was required to create new national policies, new national institutions, not public works. The new parliament was not required to build railways, to put up public buildings and build telegraph stations, but to create new national policies, and especially national institutions, which required a different sort of vision from that which he had been accustomed to. Forrest's achievements then, during his 18 years in national politics, 18 in colonial, 18 in national, his achievements in national politics can't therefore be measured by the miles of new roads and of railways built, or by the number of new wharves, schools, hospitals and other buildings which were completed. Nevertheless, I think they are impressive. I do think that he contributed to the national endeavour at a time of great importance in the building of the nation. From 1901 to 1903, as Minister for Defence, he coped with Australia's involvement in the last stages of the Boer War. He helped to raise the first Commonwealth contingents and was involved in the early planning, integrating the 6 colonial forces into what subsequently became as the CMF, the Commonwealth Military Force. He arranged administratively for the continuance of the British Naval Squadron in Australian waters. And I think he showed that in matters of national and imperial policy and in long-term planning, he had as responsible and as broad a view of Australia's future responsibilities as his chief military advisor, Major General Sir Edward Hutton, though I think he was more of an imperialist than most of his nationalist-minded cabinet colleagues would have wished. Being colonial-born, Forrest was both imperial-minded and an Australian nationalist, and he saw no contradiction whatever in the dualism of this loyalty to Crown and to country, to mother country and to birthplace. He attended the colonial conferences in London of 1887, 1897 and 1902, and supported the view that Australian defence was ultimately a question of imperial strategy, not of colonial or dominion initiative. He was a firm royalist and became more so as time passed. Whilst serving as Federal Treasurer in the Deakin government of 1905 to 7, he successfully balanced the competing claims of Australia's 7 treasuries under the tight federal bookkeeping system, and it was he who initiated the discussions which led to the creation of the separate Australian currency that we now have. He initiated the discussions which led to the adoption of what was called the per capita system of distributing federal revenue amongst the states. And his involvement in both the Australian currency and the per capita system is fully revealed in the records of the Australian Archives, now open, unrestricted. Under his administration as Treasurer of Australia, the original concept of limited federation was protected, and the states continued to be regarded as partners, though this caused his political opponents to accuse him, I think unjustly, of being a narrow states writer. From March until June 1907, he also acted as Prime Minister of Australia and acted as Minister for External Affairs, whilst Prime Minister Deakin was at a conference in London. Indeed, as we now look back, these few months of 1907 was the pinnacle of his political career. Now, when I reached this stage in the life of Forrest, I began to have serious personal doubts. In a way, I suppose, as I came to write this part of his life, I began to part company with him. And not so long ago, I sat down and tried to put pen to paper to answer my own questions about why I started to part company with somebody, as it were, I had come so close to over so long. I think partly, by 1907, as it were, I had begun to become convinced that in one way or another, Forrest had become corrupted by power and by wealth. Not in a bad sense, that is, not in the sense of using his political office to provide patronage for friends and relatives, and not in the sense of using his office as treasurer to gain access to information that he wouldn't otherwise have had. I think more in the very general and personal sense, that he was so used to being so wealthy and so used to being so powerful that he had forgotten what it was like to be otherwise. Secondly, I began to worry that he had misjudged the Australian electorate. I think although he was continuously, until the end of his career, elected from his own electorate of Swan, he had begun to misunderstand the Australian electorate. He certainly did not understand or wish to understand the new generation of Labor politicians. He substituted abuse and invective and rhetoric for serious thought. I became too, as I began to look at the records in the archives and read his private correspondence, began to think that he was perhaps too over-influenced by his new associations. He developed a close correspondence, first by correspondence and then by frequent visits with Sir Samuel Way, the Chief Justice of South Australia. And if you look at the correspondence, you'll find that they became obsessed with the possible consequences of the introduction of the federal land tax upon their own incomes. He became very closely associated with Langdon and Nathan. In fact, he developed a sort of routine geographical tour. Before federal parliament, that's the House of Representatives and the Senate, met in Melbourne, he would regularly get on a ship at Albany, sail by steam to Port Adelaide, stay overnight, perhaps 1 or 2 days with Way overnight, and catch the train to Melbourne and be in Melbourne in time for the opening of the House. He began to be influenced, I think, overmuch by his new associates in Melbourne, and especially the Fairbairns. He began to become a frequent visitor to the country houses of the upper reach of Melbourne. And I think all of this created a situation where Forrest was long since divorced from the sort of electorate that he had been used to in Western Australia and from the sort of sympathies that had made him such a successful politician in the 90s. More recently, I have begun to wonder why it was that he was so utterly uninfluenced by the right. So by the time I began to write the draft of his career up to 1907, I began to part company with him emotionally and psychologically, as it were, and I began to have deep worries. To go back to the story for a moment, ever since he had declined a portfolio in the short-lived Reed-McLean government of 1904-5, he'd worked hard to bring about a fusion of all members of the federal parliament opposed to the new Labor Party. Resigning his place in the Deakin cabinet in 1907, when he wasn't able to persuade Deakin to lead such a coalition. During the exciting times of 1908-9, when the present two-party political system in Australia was established, and when there was a short-lived Labor government, Forrest played a leading role as negotiator, emissary and spokesman for the corner Conservative group in the manoeuvres which led to the successful fusion of most non-Labor members of both houses of the federal parliament. By 1909, Forrest was back in office as treasurer and held third place in the new Deakin government. When he brought down his 13th parliamentary budget in August of 1909, he had the distinction of being the first federal treasurer in Australia to budget for a deficit. And as treasurer in 1909 to 10, he paved the way for the financial arrangements between Commonwealth and States, which lasted until 1927. Forrest and his fusion, as it was called, later Liberal Party colleagues, were out of office in 1910-13 when the Fisher Labor government made effective use of its majority in both houses of the federal parliament. However, the closely contested House of Representatives election of 1913 returned the Liberals to power with a one-seat majority, and Forrest was second in the cabinet led by Joseph Cook, who'd succeeded Deakin as party leader. Forrest's budget of 1913 continued Fisher's policy of presenting his successor with a substantial reserve. Then war broke out in Europe, and Forrest and his colleagues unhesitatingly offered all of Australia's resources to help the mother country in her hour of need. Forrest's last act as Federal Treasurer was to sign the form authorising the payment of money for the raising of the first AIF. Shortly afterwards, his party was soundly defeated at the double dissolution election of 1914, and Forrest returned to the backbench. Thereafter, the whole character of national politics in Australia underwent profound changes, generated by the demands of the war and the controversy over military conscription. In 1917, after the defeat of the first conscription referendum, there was a second fusion in which Forrest participated, this time between Hughes and his ex-Labor group and the Liberals. Forrest in 1917 again became Federal Treasurer, and in a government led by Hughes and committed in principle to the introduction of compulsory overseas military service to reinforce the troops in Europe. But it's very difficult to make a clear judgment on Forrest's 15th and last budget, which was designed for a nation at war with a vastly changed internal balance of power between federal and state authorities. The nation in 1917, as later, was at odds with itself, and as it had again narrowly rejected overseas military conscription at the referendum. In 1917, however, Forrest again experienced one of the great satisfactions of a public works politician. In that year, he was a passenger in the first train to cross on the East-West Transcontinental Railway, a project which had formed an important plank in his first policy statement of 1890, and which in fact had been a part of his conversational repertoire from 1890 to 1917. 4 times in his career in federal politics, Forrest came close to being Prime Minister of Australia. 4 times. Once in 1908, when the Labor Party had brought down the second Deakin government, and a count of heads in the House of Representatives would probably have given Forrest a majority. Second time was in 1913, when the Liberal Party caucus voted by a margin of 20 to 19 in favour of Cook rather than Forrest, the one vote difference having been made by Deakin, the former leader, who turned up at the caucus to elect his own successor. Even Menzies wouldn't have done that. Thirdly, early in 1917, when the second fusion of Liberals was being negotiated and Forrest had a clear chance, he could have displaced Hughes. And fourthly and finally, in January 1918, during the discussions which followed the defeat of the second conscription referendum. By then, however, illness and old age were against him, and he was sworn in as Federal Treasurer in 1918 for the 5th time. Late in January 1918, Forrest attended a State and Commonwealth Treasurers' Conference, but soon afterwards had an operation for the removal of a cancerous growth at his temple. On the 9th of February 1918, it was announced in the press that he had been recommended for a barony, a hereditary honour, the first Australian born to be so honoured. He was delighted and thereafter signed only his surname, but was more than a little aggrieved that he wasn't also Prime Minister and able to sit in both the House of Representatives and the House of Lords simultaneously. However, as the official citation was never completed, you won't find him in the breath. In March 1918, much weakened by the operation of his temple, he resigned from the Hughes government and late in May left Melbourne with the intention of seeking further medical aid in London if and when war conditions would allow it. He had no intention whatever of resigning from the Federal Parliament as a member for Swan, though he was hoping that when the legal formalities had been completed, he might sit for a time in the House of Lords as an elder statesman of the Empire. On the 30th of July 1918, when the war was almost over, he left the port of Albany in Western Australia with his wife and a nurse in the troop ship Marathon, bound for London with the AIF reinforcements. He was very ill because the radium used for the treatment of his cancerous growth was eating into his skull, and suffering much pain. When he celebrated his 71st birthday at sea on the 22nd of August, he was sailing up the west coast of Africa, and when the ship anchored off Sierra Leone on the 3rd of September 1918, he died in agony. Now I should pause a moment, because like Marcus Clarke's best novel, For the Term of His Natural Life, there should, I think, be two endings to this story. The one you've just heard, the ending, tragic ending to a great life. But I think I should, as a biographer, offer my own ending. Was Forrest one of the nation's statesmen? I think the answer I must give now is that no, he was not. His parliamentary record, his public speeches, the speeches reported in the contemporary press, his administrative activities, his private conversations, and his private correspondence, which I've read, these don't reveal the vision and the grasp of a national statesman. Rather, I think, they show that he was a successful broker as a regional politician of the type we all know. And at a time, I think, when political debate in Australia was not affected much by competing political philosophies and by the complexities of modern federalism. Like many of his successors to the present day in Australian state politics, he had a distinctly successful political style. But it was a style which we all know so well. The sort of style that lays more emphasis on improving the physical environment than on redistributing the wealth of society and removing social injustices and inequalities. Lays more emphasis on developing the economy rather than meeting the social and cultural needs of society. I suppose above all else, Forrest, the man of the 90s, was a man of his time. A man who showed how energy and grit and determination could enable a wage earner from a working class background to rise up the social ladder and achieve wealth and influence and political power within both the capitalist system and the parliamentary system. But these days, I think the modern historian must say in the final judgment, and I do believe that historians should make moral judgment, that Forrest's values, his views, were those of the imperial establishment. They were elitist, they were racist, they were exploitive, they were patronising, and they were overmuch concerned with the outward signs and the baubles of success. And being now myself the age that Forrest was when he entered federal politics, I feel free to say that had I been at the door of the federal parliament in 1901, I wouldn't want it to have been his political ally or even his friend. And perhaps, maybe, you'll now understand why I haven't finished Bowl 2.
I'm curious as to whether the speaker would consider that Hughes was more statesmanlike than Forrest. And secondly, surely he's left out the very interesting details of how Forrest came to get the baronetcy.
It's very simple. Prime Minister Hughes, in a quite defensible desire to remove Forrest as Federal Treasurer from his cabinet, which Forrest himself nearly came to be the leader of, simply recommended that he be given a barony of the United Kingdom, please. And to the chagrin of Hughes, this misfired, because Forrest was delighted to accept the honour and declined to resign from the cabinet. And I have had a great deal of pleasure in reading the Federal Treasury files, all signed simply by Forrest. You'll be interested to know that when Lord Casey was elevated to the barony, I've forgotten the word, I received an inquiry from a top administrator in Australia's federal government for file numbers, or where they could quickly cross-check as to whether Casey could be a member of the Australian Parliament and a member of the House of Lords simultaneously. The issue was unresolved and is still unresolved. With regard to the important question, the first one you asked, I don't think there's any doubt whatever, despite perhaps my own political opinions these days, that Hughes was a statesman in the normal sense of making judgments about statesmen. And I suppose the canon would be a sense of vision, and a wide vision, and a sense of seeing one's own nation in its wider context. I think there's no doubt whatever that Hughes had that. He might justly be denigrated for having left one political party and led another, and being devious, and all those other things that he was. But I don't think there's any doubt that Hughes was a statesman, and I have no doubt that he out-statesmaned Forrest. Yes. I wouldn't have wanted to work with Hughes either. I wouldn't have wanted even to have lunch with him. And I would hate to have been anyone who depended upon Hughes for character reference.
Like many others, I'd like to thank Professor Crowley for that invaluable research guide in South Australia. And there about Forrest, well, I wonder whether your disenchantment with his later life is, it seems to me on first glance to be so dull. You know, everything goes right, relentless success. He's a sort of machine created to the times. Did he have any dark secrets, you know, because a biography is always better for some entertaining wickedness or misfortune. Everything seems to have gone right for him except his death.
About, you see, at a relatively early age he became Surveyor-General of Western Australia on a salary that would be the equivalent of about 100 times a wage earner's salary. He never looked back from that point. There was no income taxation. He then became Premier, and under the Constitution was guaranteed a tax-free income. He used that money to good purpose. He had a number of brothers who were involved in pastoral and investment activities, and he joined his brothers in various enterprises. By the time he got to federal parliament, he was probably earning about 20,000 sterling a year at a time when the average wage was £2.10. He was enormously rich. He never had to worry about money. He was very liberal with it. I mean, he distributed amongst because he had no children of his own, he was very generous, as it were, amongst the children of his wife and his brothers. He now died. I'm terribly sorry. Absolutely, despite what Humphrey McQueen had said, there's just no sex scale anywhere. There's just nothing. There's no evidence whatever anywhere along the line, and I'm absolutely convinced there was no problem there. Some people might say he just got too fat. So, of course, that's not fair. His wife couldn't have any children, and when I wrote her biography, I had to regurgitate the family traditions, that she couldn't have any children because she had a severe writing accident in her late teens. But I've consulted various professors of medicine on this, and I'm told that you can fix it and don't prevent pregnancy. There's just nothing wrong. I'm terribly sorry. There's no financial skullduggery. There's no manipulation of finances. There's no nothing. It's just one constant series of baubles and picture honours and successes. It's beyond me. Sorry.
You've given us such a proliferation of facts and ideas that it's hard to see the trees for the forest. But Forrest is a great hero over in Western Australia. This is the impression I got when I was over there. Is it then really justified?
Well, it's a heroic. All Western Australians' view of Forrest stops about 1903. That is, it's heroic in the Western Australian school system, the educational system, because the books all say that. Because he was the first Premier, because he initiated the Gold Coast water scheme, because he built a harbour at Fremantle, and these other public works sorts of things. And that's where the heroism stops. Most West Australians are not the least interested in what he did afterwards, and one suspects because they don't like the idea of successful West Australians becoming successful federal politicians, because that's bad, because that's desertion. That's wow, that's West Australia. You know? But in fact, he did play an important part in a number of national enterprises. And that's what I try and emphasise. I've got this terrible paradox that I recognise his ability to do certain things. He was very keen on the Australian currency. He fought the Bank of England tooth and nail over the 10-shilling note. The Bank of England refused to allow Australia to print a 10-shilling note on the grounds that the working class would dirty it and it'd destroy it, and you'd have to print so many of them they wouldn't be able to look after them properly. Forrest was very keen on having an Australian currency, which of course the next Labor government, official Labor government, immediately enacted, and it's from that date that we have the notes. He was very good at that sort of thing, but I part company with him on these other things. He from 1910 to 1913, in the period when Labor had a majority for the first time in both houses of the federal parliament, he was just plain lazy. He attended parliament every now and again. He went to Gilbert and Sullivan. He took young girls to the theatre, but quite innocently. His nieces and nephews, the girls. He was just lazy. I just part company with him. He dressed up for occasions. He liked to wear medals and sort of thing.
I'm intrigued that the Western Australian Parliament got its lower house rather late. What was his role in this? Was it despite Forrest?
Oh, quite simple really. Western Australia received imperial convicts from 1850 to 1868, and there was still a large number under detention in the 1870s, and the total Western Australian white population was enough to warrant a parliament. Quite simple. I mean, the biggest single income of Western Australian government in the 1850s, 60s and 70s was the imperial pay of the soldiers and the guards. It just wasn't enough money. No goldfields, nothing to warrant a parliament in the normal sense of the word. It had a legislative council which was elected. It had a secret ballot to elect members too, quite in advance of Britain. So it's not a parliament in the normal sense. To require a parliament, you require an income and a budget. You got to look after your own affairs, raise your own taxes. There wasn't anything much to tax. No, there was no insidious connection there. I wish somebody solved my problems for me. There.
As one was a West Australian undergraduate in the early 60s, I have a distinct memory of Professor Crowley saying that he could only get appointed to the House of Lords, but Forrest could only get appointed to the House of Lords because he had no children, therefore being barren in both senses of the word. Nursed that for 17 years and couldn't forgive me yet. But I'm a little concerned by some of the implications on the latter part of the talk. I'm not quite sure whether you mean that you're never going to finish the biography, or just that it's merely becoming more and more difficult for you to do so as you lose empathy with your subject. It doesn't seem to me necessary, although it obviously makes it much easier for a biographer to be totally sympathetic, let alone empathetic with his subject. Surely it is possible to be able to stand aside to some extent and criticise. In fact, I think one does get very suspicious and often tired of biographies which are very largely eulogies. Would it not indeed be of considerable interest to chart the sort of developments that you have, in great detail, that you summarised so well tonight? How it is that somebody can be such a success at a certain stage in his life and then gradually be bought off by the trinkets and the baubles and cease to be so effective.
I will finish, but it's getting harder month by month. I'm not going to default on the Australian community in that sense. I'll finish, but I've been trying to tell you people tonight that I suppose something I shouldn't really tell people about. I suppose most biographies don't talk about this sort of thing. They finish, or else the publishers shoot them more. Something happens, but I've been undergoing real travail. And I thought you might be interested in the reasons why the travail, and they're intimately associated with my own professional life, as things come and go. It's not that basically I've myself changed my political attitudes. I don't think so. I think I'm still old left, in the trad sense. It's just that increasingly as I come to know the man, I have this trauma, which makes it very hard to write. Very hard indeed. I still hold to my earlier remark. I'm quite sure Hughes has that in mind. I'm quite sure Hughes was sufficiently vindictive and bad to do just that sort of thing, knowing full well. But of course the record, unfortunately, goes against both of them. As far as paid his money, I've seen the clear check. When you become a baron, you have to pay for a patent. Forrest sent the check. The receipt was received, but before the Great Seal of Britain could be put on it, he died. So he was never a lord, never a baron. And that doesn't like the Western countries don't like to hear that.
One more question. Somebody has their hand up. One more question. I have to look somebody up.
I'd be very interested if anyone in this place thinks that they like Forrest.
Professor, could you just comment briefly on, you stated why Forrest got a barony. What would have been the dispute, do you think, between his barony and Wade's baronetcy? They were both barons.
Who? Wade?
The same way. Given the imperial criteria, presumably London...
Wade's baronetcy was hereditary.
Wade's baronetcy, yeah.
Yeah, hereditary.
Because he didn't have heirs.
They didn't have any children. Yeah. There was a baronet.
No, legitimate ones, yeah.
Only insofar as the higher status, of course. I don't like Way either. I've read all the Way Forrest correspondence, and it seems to be a mountain of pettiness. So much of it is about how we must stop these Labour ruffies from taxing the guts out of the Australian rich, and about how Way was terribly worried because the federal land tax of 1911 wouldn't make his hills property profitable much longer. And, really quite trivial things that you didn't think Chief Justices for 40 years would even bother to worry about. We must keep together to prevent these people taking away the well-earned wealth of the rich of Australia. I just don't like Way. And that Leichhardt Way, by the way, I don't think is good enough. I think Way deserves a better one than that. But, Forrest had very close associations with all the leading I suppose you could say, conservative politicians in South Australia in the first decade of the 20th century. Very close association with Rockland as fundraisers and the organisation of the Fusion Party, 1910 to 13, very close. One of the reasons why I wrote the biography of Lady Forrest, by the way, wasn't just because the Caracalla Club asked me to write something, was because she was one of the very first women in Australia to become publicly involved in politics. She voted for the first time in her life at the federal referendum in Western Australia in 1900, which was only the second time that women had ever voted in Australia. The previous time in the South Australian election. And then for the next 13, 14 years took part in all Forrest's electorate campaigns. I was interested in the way an upper class woman became involved in Australian politics. I hope I haven't worried people. He wasn't unworried myself. It's nice to share the agony sometimes.
Well, this may not be a trivial question. I'm curious as to who you do like.
I like the first Forrest. I like the Forrest involved one very much. I think he was a great achiever. And he did important practical things. He opened up lands for settlement. He made it possible for small farmers to go on the land. He did those sorts of practical things as a surveyor and a Surveyor-General. He was that sort of person. And in the first 2 or 3 years of his premiership, he spent his time really helping people to live and to live well. But when confronted with opposition that questioned his right to do these things, and to be solely responsible for doing, when confronted by people who said that, look, it's all very well for you to be successful and accumulate wealth, but what about the people who haven't got a chance to do it? Then I start not to like him as much.
So was there one main stumbling block that you put all down to? Where he got out of his depth?
I don't think he ever got out of his depth. I think I don't think he ever consciously realised what had happened to himself. I don't think he ever really sort of said, now look, John, you're from a working class background, your father had practically nothing, your brothers had nothing, you came up, you've made a success, but stop and think of it, but he didn't. And nowhere in any of his speeches, in any of his correspondence, and he had a voluminous correspondence, but when he was a federal parliamentarian, he stayed at the Grand Hotel in Melbourne, and every week communicated backwards and forwards with his brothers and his nephews and nieces in Western Australia all over the place, and managed his estate this way, and a great deal of his correspondence survived. There is no social criticism whatever in any of it. Nothing. There's not so much as a suggestion that the meek might inherit the earth. Nothing.
You said just now that he opened up land for settlement and encouraged small farmers and then he closed money. Why isn't there the equivalent of the German migration, like we've got Prof Crowley here? Why did Western Australia get a lot of ethnic groups sort of migrating there? A lot of early German.
Well, I think the answer is quite simple. The British government was running a convict system in Western Australia until the 1870s, but it wasn't on until then. The last big wave of German migration to Australia in the 19th century was to Queensland in the 1880s. Queensland had special government agents in Germany recruiting at that time, but Western Australia had nothing to offer. It didn't have the coastal fringe that Queensland had. In the 90s, Forrest legislated specifically to exclude all Asiatics from holding gold miners' licenses and to own factories or any other property. I mean, there was a complete prohibition of Asian migration. And the migration of the 90s was largely, as I think everyone knows, not an overseas immigration into Western Australia, but a resettlement of Australia's population from the depressed areas of Eastern Australia to Western Australia. The highest proportion of gold miners on the Western Australian and Eastern Goldfields in the 1890s were Victorians. And the highest proportion of them were men, and we know how much money they sent back every week through money orders to their families in Victoria. Because the Forrest government kept meticulous records, because it was the Forrest government that introduced the money order system. But migration, ethnic migration, wasn't a real possibility anyway, because there's only much to attract them. I suppose the first big ethnic population of any sense at all was the Greek settlement schemes in the 1920s. Is that the ethnic?